For instance, I was listening to this guy, and he was a painter, and he was painting, and he wasn't educated, but he was making really great money painting in order to support his family. And then what happened is he fell off a roof, and he shattered his ankle, and he couldn't paint anymore. He said, this was a massive, unexpected change in my life, an external pressure point. He said, but what it did is it finally forced me to have to transition to become the person I was meant to be. He said, I was painting because it made good money. I didn't like it. I didn't enjoy it. And it wasn't good for me. And so he says it wasn't until this accident happened that he was able to finally pursue, because he had enough knowledge, he had enough hurt, he could see, he started to learn everything that he needed to finally enact that change. And the other thing that's really important to understand about this is oftentimes we tend not to change because we're fearful of it. So, but it's impossible not to change. And so I hope you see the juxtaposition of that, is that being fearful of change only makes you fearful of the sun rising the next day. Welcome, everybody, to the Salty Pastor Podcast. Our goal is to coach you up in your faith because it's what you think, what you believe, what you know that makes all the difference in your life. It's not what anybody else thinks. It's not what anybody else knows. It's not anybody else's opinion about how you ought to live your life. And no one else's idea of what you should or should not be doing that ultimately makes any real difference in your life. And it certainly won't help you navigate the crazy world in which we live. No, it's what you believe, what you think, what you know that makes all the difference in navigating this incredibly wonderful, up and down, mysterious thing we call life. So as the Salty Pastor, my goal is not to tell you what to think at all. I want to focus on how you think. And the reason why I want to do that is because when you evaluate how you think, you learn so much about yourself. And that's where you can really start to change patterns of behavior and thinking, because you're like, it's not just what I'm thinking, it's how am I thinking about it? And once you get into knowing why you think the way you do, and you clarify what you believe and why you believe it, that's when you start to understand your purpose in life. That's when you understand where you fit in this grand scheme of the universe. So these are things that I think you got to work on for yourself. Nobody else can tell you what to do, how to do it, give it to you. The reason why so many people miss out on life, the reason why so many people are miserable and lonely and isolated in their life is because they have no idea who they are. They've never really thought, well, how do I think and how have I concluded that I believe what I believe and what are my core values? And because they've never done this, life is miserable. So you got to answer these questions for yourself. And that's why I'm here. I'm here to help you do that. I'm here to help you discover what you believe, why you believe it, your core values, the things that make you the unique you that you are, that you can find your identity, ultimately your purpose and meaning in life. And that's what we're all about. Now, I am Dr. Douglas Peak. I like to say I am highly educated in things nobody cares about anymore. But I also have almost 38 years of full-time ministry experience, and it's always been about people. Okay. And we're in a series now all about transitions. And if you go back and listen to podcasts from last week, we really dug into the notion between change and transitions, how they're different, how everybody goes through transitions in life. Some people, it helps them grow and mature. It gives them opportunity to evaluate how they're thinking, clarify their values, see what their code of honor is all about. But for some people, it just ruins them. You know, it defeats them. It makes them defensive, cynical, bitter. And that's all because they didn't understand that life is filled with transitions because, of course, things change. And how we think about transitions make all the difference between whether we navigate them successfully or unsuccessfully. So we started to dig into that. And one of the reasons why last week we talked about it's so difficult to navigate transition successfully is because of fog. Everything just gets so foggy. And if you don't expect the fog, if you don't think there should be fog, then it is going to be one frustrating transition in your life. Now, today we're going to talk about how transitions can change you or not change you. But in order to do that, we're going to jump back in to the Old Testament, particularly the book of Jacob. And we started by studying the life of Abram. And now we're going to study the life of his grandson by the name of Jacob. Now, Abram's son, he became Abraham once he became a father. Abraham had his son Isaac. And Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was a kind of a guy's guy, a hunter, really big, swarthy guy. They said he was really hairy. Jacob, on the other, he was basically more kind of a thinner guy. He's more of a homebody. Some people even describe him as a mama's boy growing up. Now, what happened is Jacob basically deceived his father, Israel, who used to be Isaac. He deceived his father into blessing him with the family inheritance and blessing instead of his brother Esau. And then what he does in chapter 27 is you read the whole story about how he does this. And then what happens is he runs away because he is fearful of his great hunter and manly man, Esau. Now, you kind of see what he does. He goes to live with his uncle, who is also known as Laban. And while he's there, he meets some of his daughters, and he falls in love with Rachel. And while he's there, he works for 7 years to win her hand, but his uncle deceives him and marries him off to Leah, her sister. So he works for another 7 years, and then he marries Rachel. So now he's got two wives, and while he's there, he has all of this growth in his flocks and his wealth and so forth. And so he kind of goes through that. But then what he does is he decides, I've had enough of my Uncle Laban stuff. So he basically, in the middle of the night, he kind of gets up in chapter 31 and he leaves. And then Laban comes after him, right? And you read about that whole thing going on. So what am I getting at is, well, there's all these changes. He goes off single, he gets married, now he has kids, he starts a business, the business grows, his uncle gets jealous, his uncle tries to take it from him, then he basically leaves in the middle of the night, and then his uncle saddles up his army and goes after him to chase him down. And where's he going to go? He doesn't know where to go. Can he go back to the land of his father? Well, the Esau's there, and he's worried that Esau, when he gets there, is going to want to kill him for stealing the blessing. And so he's in all this transition. He has a dream, right? And it's called Jacob's Ladder. And then what's really, really interesting is what happens in chapter 32. All right. So he leaves Laban, his uncle. His uncle chases after him. They make an agreement to not harm each other. They just kind of separate. And then he's getting closer to his home country where Esau is. And what happens is, before he meets Esau in chapter 33, I want to listen to the following words beginning with verse 24. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, this man, for the dawn is breaking." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel." So I'm sorry, I misspoke earlier about Isaac being Israel. It's Jacob whose name was changed to Israel. Sometimes I get all these people, I misspeak a little bit. So apologize for that. He says, "I'm going to give you a new name. And so your new name will be Israel." And the name Israel is really interesting because it has different flavors, but it basically means one who struggles with God. And when you read about the Jewish people, even to today, it seems like they're always struggling with God in some form or another. And he says, Jacob then named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved." And now the sun rose up upon him just as he crossed over to Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip because it is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of the hip. So this became a cultural phenomenon, or cultural meme that stuck with everybody, that they basically said, look, this is a place where Jacob became Israel, and this is where the name of our nation comes from. Now, why would I bring that up when it comes to transitions? Because whenever your name, particularly in the Old Testament, is changed, it's a pretty dramatic event. And the reason why it's dramatic is because you go from who you used to be to who you are. And you see this in the New Testament a lot. You saw Simon, the apostle. He followed Jesus everywhere. And then Jesus actually changes his name to Peter, which means rock. And so Simon, who is a passionate, followed his emotions kind of guy, Jesus changes his name to solid, stable. You're like a rock. It's really interesting because Saul was a man who was a Pharisee who persecuted the church. He meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, and then his name changes to Paul. And so we see these name changes because they're very significant of life change. And that's what I want to really dig into transitions today, is this simple question. How in the world do people actually change? I mean, how is it that Jacob, going through all of this stuff in his life, suddenly wrestles with God and he comes out a different man, so different that his name is changed? Now, we live in a world today where people see it's really difficult to change, right? In some ways, we say, well, I'm simply a product of how I was raised. I've said this before, and I think you need to realize this, is that if you really want to evaluate how you think, then you really don't do that until you get into your 30s, because you look back and you realize, well, this is how I was raised. And you start to realize how it has impacted you either negatively or positively. There's other people who say that we're just simply products of our DNA sequence, and that determines how we deal with challenges and obstacles in life. It's similar to a person who has like really fast metabolism. Have you ever met these people? They eat whatever they want and they're always thin. It just seems like it's not fair, is it? That they have metabolism that moves so fast. Well, in the same way, I was listening to a researcher, a child psychologist, and he was talking about the notion that your child is a clean slate is just a myth. He said that when your child is born, there's over 400 psychological DNA markers within that child. There's certain ways that they're just going to process information, things that influence their personality, all of these things. The Bible calls this bent. And that is that all human beings, particularly children, have a certain bent. That is like how no two sticks are bent the same way. There's no two tree limbs that are bent the same way. Similar to that with human beings, is that we all have a unique bent. And this is sometimes influenced heavily by our DNA markers. So if I'm driven by this, does this mean I can't change? Does this mean that I'm just going to always be the way I've always been because that's the way I am? Is that it? Or can you go through something in your life, a transition that is forced by a change, but gives you the opportunity internally to transform into something else? See, that's what I think is a really great question to think about, to really focus on. How in the world do people change? And more importantly, how in the world do I change? That is really, I think, a phenomenal question to ask yourself, particularly when you realize change from an external standpoint, when you compare it to transitions, is inevitable. It always happens. So change is life, and life is going to treat you a certain way. However, transitions allow you to look at the changes that you're facing in your life as opportunities or curses. And I think that's really key. I was listening to John Maxwell, and he's kind of a leadership guru. He's been around a long, long time. He's done a lot of leadership training. And he said something that I thought was really fascinating. He said that people only change. In other words, they go through a transition and transform into a different person only in 4 basic ways. He says the first way is that if you learn enough you want to change. So if you gather enough information, if you learn enough, maybe from observing other people, you're older, more mature, so you take in knowledge better. You've learned how you learn. That makes you want to change. So that's kind of like an act of will, right? Then he said the second thing is when people see enough, when they see enough examples, then they are inspired to change. I just think of how whenever you look at a gym advertisement or you look at a nutritional supplement advertisement, you always have a guy with a before picture and a after picture. When you ever look at any type of weight loss regimen or diet, they always have people with a before picture and then a after picture. And you just see hundreds, thousands of these over time. And the reason why they do this is because they want to inspire you to change. And that is when people see enough, they are inspired to change. Now, here's another one that he says that I find really interesting. He says, when people receive enough, they are able to change. See, sometimes we can't change because we just don't have the tools or skill set to do it. And so we need to receive something. We need to receive training, or we need to receive skills or tools that allow us to change. But the biggest one that he talks about that causes us to change is hurt. He says, when we hurt enough, we then have to change. I was listening to Dave Ramsey, and he says, well, when you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, then you're going to change. And that's kind of what this means, is when we hurt enough, we get to that point where we realize, I just have to change. I can't stay the way I am. So with these things in mind, let's dig into these qualities, these 4 qualities that we can focus on in order to navigate the transitions in our life. Okay, before we jump into those, we've got to kind of think about, the basic foundation that we've laid before that helps us really dig in. And that is, number 1, change, particularly external factors, is inevitable. All life is filled with change. You can't escape it. It's going to happen. Sometimes it just happens because you age. You can't live in yesterday. You can't live in tomorrow. You live in today. And guess what? There's going to be another new day tomorrow. So change is inevitable. The other foundational thing that we have to realize is that these change that's inevitable is an external factor that creates pressure in our life. We enter each new day losing the day, and the opportunity of that day of yesterday is gone. So you lose all of the opportunity of yesterday when the new day starts. Now, some people say, well, that seems pretty obvious to me. Well, the thing is, we tend not to live that way at all. Because we are aging, because things are changing and nothing stays static, everything has a shelf life, what happens is we forget that these external changes always create pressure in our life, okay? And that pressure is an opportunity to look at the transition it causes as something that is beneficial instead of traumatic in our lives. This is very important when you're dealing with a traumatic or an unexpected change, and how that can totally redirect you. For instance, I was listening to this guy, and he was a painter, and he was painting, and he wasn't educated, but he was making really great money painting in order to support his family. And then what happened is he fell off a roof, and he shattered his ankle, and he couldn't paint anymore. He said, this was a massive unexpected change in my life, an external pressure point. He said, but what it did is it finally forced me to have to transition to become the person I was meant to be. He said, I was painting because it made good money. I didn't like it. I didn't enjoy it. And it wasn't good for me. And so he said, it wasn't until this accident happened that he was able to finally pursue, because he had enough knowledge, he had enough hurt, he could see, he started to learn everything that he needed to finally enact that change. And the other thing that's really important to understand about this is oftentimes we tend not to change because we're fearful of it. So, but it's impossible not to change. And so I hope you see the juxtaposition of that, is that being fearful of change only makes you fearful of the sun rising the next day, because it's gonna change. Now that doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared and protected and planned and organized and managed, but it does mean you can't stop it. And that's a very important thing to understand. Now, the other thing is this, is that whenever there's an external pressure point of change, it always creates an internal transition. And that is key. If we know how to navigate transitions on the inside, it determines whether or not we will what? Do it successfully or unsuccessfully. It's whether you become a more authentic version of who you are meant to be, or you become a worse version of who you are meant to be. So if you want to kind of figure out who you're meant to be, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the series we did earlier in the summer on identity. So now let's get into these 4 qualities that I mentioned earlier that help us focus on how to navigate transition successfully in our lives. So if we take what John Maxwell said and we kind of invert them from statements into questions, then I think it helps you learn or discover how to navigate future transitions more successfully. And the first one is this, based on what he said earlier, is he said this: learning enough, then people want to change. So whenever you're in a transition, one of the best things to ask yourself is this: what can I learn? What can I learn? Now, let's say you go through an unexpected transition in your life, okay? Let's go back to the story of the guy who fell off the roof. At first, he was really angry, right? He was angry at the homeowner for not keeping their shingles up properly. And so he felt like, well, I should sue them for a lack of maintenance, negligence on maintaining the roof. And then he's thought to himself that he was angry about the ladder manufacturer because it didn't meet specs. And so he was angry with all of these situations. And one day he was sitting there with a really good friend of his. And his friend said to him, he said, "Come on, bro, admit you knew it was a bad idea to climb up on that roof." And he said that question just hit him like a ton of bricks. He says, because deep down inside, when he really was honest with himself, he knew that he had a bad feeling about climbing up on that roof to paint that particular part of the house. Now, this is what's really interesting, is that oftentimes we start off asking the question in a transition of what can we learn about how never let this happen again. So we blame other people, we blame situations, we blame their negligence, their intent, we blame other people a lot. But what we end up doing is we rob ourselves of the opportunity to learn something about ourselves in this process. Like I was talking to a mentor a while back, and he said something that's really interesting. He said, whenever you're in a pickle or whenever you're in an unexpected change or transitions, he says, one of the best things to do is try to sit down and ask yourself, why am I so mad about this? What is it about this situation that just, chaps my hide? Why is it that this angers me so much? Why can't I let this go? And those were really great questions to help me learn. And that's why I want to challenge you, because what those questions do is reveal how you think about things. And it's often how we think about things that stop us from going through a transition successfully. Now, the second question is this: what can I see? because John Maxwell says, if you see enough, you're inspired to change. And I was thinking of a passage that has to do with suffering, and it's written by the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter. And it's really interesting because he talks about suffering, and a lot of times transitions, we have to admit, particularly ones that are unexpected, are suffering. They're very difficult. And he says, verse 8 of chapter 4 of 1 Peter, he says, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls about like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. It says, but resist him firm in your faith, which that's cool. But here's the what do you see part. He goes, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being overcome or accomplished by your brothers who are in the world. So what he's saying is that, okay, you can resist the devil. You can stay firm in your faith. Why? Because you see other people doing it. And these people are still in the world with you today. So my question for you is, in the transition that you're going through, let me ask a really tough question. Are you arrogant enough to believe that you're the only person on the face of the planet throughout 10,000 years of human history that's ever gone through this? I think not. I think that you can ask yourself, what do I see in the midst of all this? And what you're asking yourself to do is, what should my mind's eye be drawn to? Should it be drawn to my defeat or my potential victory? Should it be to how much this hurts or how strong I can become? You see, all of these things are difficult, but it's what you see that makes the difference in how you change through the transition. If all you see is negativity, if all you see is hurt and betrayal and disappointment, those things may all be real and true. But guess what? You're not going to change into anyone who's stronger, more at peace, more loving, and more forgiving. That's just not going to happen. And people say, well, I don't want to be that way. Well, look, you're only cheating yourself when you don't live that way, right? You're only cheating yourself. So that's why ask yourself, what do I see? And what should my mind's eye be drawn to? What should my focus be in the midst of this really difficult transition in my life? And that makes all the difference to how quickly you'll transition and how you can do it successfully instead of unsuccessfully. So let's go to the third question. John Maxwell says, when you receive enough, you're able to change. What do you need to receive? If you find yourself in a transition, let's say there's been some external change in your life, right? And one of the biggest changes that most people kind of ignore or we forget about is when we add children into our family. That's right. Your first birth, your first child is a massive change. Then your second is just, it's not an addition. It's a multiplication. It's a cubed effect. I mean, it is just off the charts. And if you're in science, you'll understand it's called the three-body problem. And that is, in physics, if you have a body, right, like a sun, and then you have a planet, you can mathematically figure out everything that's going to happen between the sun and its gravitational effect on the planet and the planet's rotation around that body and how it works. I mean, you can predict it to, within, millimeters. It's so easy to do because of the math. But what's fascinating is if you introduce a third body into that, it's total chaos. There's no way to predict anything. And that's what happens when you have a second child. It becomes total chaos at some level. Your whole life changes. And we forget that. And so oftentimes I see fathers and young moms, they're struggling with how to adjust to all of this change in their life. And what's really interesting is you can become bitter or you can become cynical, or guess what? you can become better. You can become that person who is the peace in the midst of the storm, that person who always has their mind's eye focused on the successful raising of these children. And so the daily grind, the daily annoyances, the daily filth, the daily messes don't bother you, but they become opportunities for growth. I remember a story of a very successful physicist who was a part of mapping the human genome in the 90s. And he was talking to a reporter who asked him about, where did your love of science and learning come from? And without batting an eye, he said, my mother. He said, my mother. He says, it was so interesting. If we were at dinner and I would spill my milk, my mom wouldn't ever get upset. She would start asking me questions like, how much milk was in there? And why did it spread that far out on the table? And so every time I saw an accident or every time I made a mistake, I became curious about the result or its impact. He said, that's where my love of science began. You see, isn't that interesting? Because she didn't cry over spilt milk, she gave her son a gift that directed him his entire life. So let's ask the last question, and that is this: are you hurting enough? Does the pain of your current transition force you to do things differently? And this is something that is more difficult the older you get. That's right. You know the old cliche, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. Well, it's hard to get somebody who's older to do things differently. But it's the pain that we suffer that in the current transition of life that often forces us to grow. I was listening to a comedian, and I've quoted him before. I'll quote it again. He goes, good character is forged in the problems of life. It's on the anvil. He says, show me a trust fund kid, and I'll show you a kid with weak character. That's something that is lost in our society today, I think, in some ways, and that is that desire for young people to go out and make their own way, to do it themselves, not realizing that when you don't make your own way, you don't do it yourself, you rely on other people, you develop an attitude of entitlement. And that entitlement robs you of maturity. It robs you of security. It robs you of a sense of meaning or purpose in your life. So don't be that. Don't be entitled. Ask yourself, how can the pain of my current situation, right, force me to do things differently? Well, we're going to leave it at that today, and we're going to dig a little bit more into practical application on how we change in the midst of transitions and how we can adopt attitudes and thought patterns prior to them that allow us to successfully navigate them. Salted Pastor signing off. Do me a really big favor. Go to our YouTube channel, like and subscribe. Also, go to our website. Click on that donate button and help us grow this ministry. It's exciting to see what God is doing. I want you to be a part of it. Salty Pastor signing off. Remember, always think for yourself.